Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Verdun, one of the longest in modern history, a true inferno. For 10 months in 1916 the French and the Germans were engaged in such test of strength that would drain both armies. This battle was one of the most harrowing and exhausting of the Great War, resulting in an apparently futile slaughter of men that ultimately led to a stalemate. I already discussed trench warfare in its essentials, so of course there was a broader purpose to this attrition warfare that we will also come back on in the strategic and political essence. Verdun, if anything, shows the resilience and determination of both sides in pursuing such strategy, both from the offensive and defensive standpoint. And it's in fact the outcome, the result as a whole, that must be understood in the context of the country's decisions in the following years of the war, and of course together with the other battles coming up to the end, right, in the broader mass counted on the millions of dead, really understanding the sense, if we can, of this whole thing. I will not actually discuss the myth of the butchers, and so on. However, we will highlight how, of course, difficult any prediction is in war to begin with, and how, in fact, the unprecedented scale and destruction of this war is an additional, if not excuse, at least something you can add to the difficulty of such positive hope. Also remembering, however, that in the process, and in fact World War I was, through these various steps, each and every one of the latter left a mark that in some cases, especially in this one, would in later times help paradoxically to unite Europe in the memory of such tragedy, and that still, also from just a military point of view, stands out as one of the big questions, right, of existence, if you want, not just of war or politics and the specific historical context, but say why do we do this, right? And there is always an explanation to it. The casualties of the Battle of Verdun were almost incalculable. It wouldn't be even much of an exaggeration to say, over the course of the 303 days of the battle, from February the 21st to December the 18th, 1916, only an approximate estimate can be provided. Around 160,000 French and 140,000 Germans were killed, which of course speaks of a much greater number of wounded, of general casualties. And so when considering the latter, historians estimate that an average of between 70,000 and 100,000 men became combat ineffective each month on that battlefield. All right, and remember that we're witnessing something very similar to this in scale in Ukraine. Even after more than a century has passed, the territory surrounding Verdun remains poisoned and uninhabitable. We will understand exactly why, because other great battles that counted hundreds of thousands of dead did not transform the local landscape so much as for Verdun. There was a great deal of, as you know, fire, power concentration just for the importance of the artillery, especially from the German side. And as far as the soldiery, like a continuous sort of back and forth, that while typical of World War I, at least to the degree by which the Western Front specifically really shifted only a few kilometers from Switzerland to the North Sea, was really fought that intensely, that savagely for these very meters of ground, of towns as well. Not everything was a trench, as a matter of fact. The ground of Verdun is saturated with shell fragments, debris, and gases that have permeated the soil. The remains of soldiers, along with their personal effects and weapons, can still be found buried in trenches among the enormous clods of earth disturbed by explosions. Verdun is thus not merely yet another battlefield, or just one of a great battle in contemporary history, nor a faded memory of the past. It stands in the very heart of Europe as an indelible testament to a horror that words alone cannot encapsulate, nor can they provide even a whisper of meaning. Naturally, as military historians, this is instead what we seek to do. Sometimes, just sometimes, you can, of course, while keeping to research this, however, stop for a moment and realize the immensity of what it was in comparison to you as a person, and really understanding how gigantic even the effort of making sense of it all really is. It's not that it can't be done, as we were saying before, but it really puts a lot of things in perspective that about your life, about the past, that can help you coping with such craft. So let's talk about the strategies of this battle. Of course, are quite interesting as peculiar during the Great War. So within weeks of the onset of the war itself, the nations involved realized that the most dire predictions regarding its catastrophic nature had not just materialized, but had also been surpassed by a tragic reality beyond imagination. We've seen it in other videos, that the great calculation of how the next and expectedly big war, if anything, just by the scale of force involved, many underestimated how, in fact, long these forces would have had to be exercised, had really pointed at the potential, destruction potential that the new forces of mass society and the new technological achievements, the greater resources availability could have produced. However, after a few months after the beginning of the war, everybody realized that this would have been far beyond what it had been conventionally realized before the same war, even by those who had actually nailed it, that had accurately predicted the existence of prolonged, bitter, trench positional warfare. However, this conflict would not cease just because of that until someone achieved victory, rather, regardless of the consequences, and it was up to the military leadership to discover how to accomplish this, searching for a moment of brilliance that would facilitate the formulation of a decisive strategy amidst the dense fog of ongoing battles. In my recent videos about how trench war happened, we talked about these doctrinal issues, and we observed how there was essentially a lock, right, a stalemate, not just in a physical, say, territorial sense of the armies fighting against one another, but also an intellectual one, right? Speaking of military theory, how to apply the notions acquired during the first years at this point of the war wouldn't really provide with a solution with the strategic, more even than the tactical stalemate that had produced. While the situation on the Western Front had settled into a substantially positional warfare characterized by trenches, barbed wire, and machine guns, the Imperial German Army was experiencing successes against the Russian forces on the Eastern Front through maneuver tactics in open fields. Never forget about this, that not just, of course, were other fronts other than the Western one, that did not experience such positional warfare, at least to the extent it was experienced there, but that also, at the beginning, especially at the beginning and at the end of the war, movement was obviously there, like the entire sense of a collapsing army, the necessity of essentially destroying it completely and pressing it hard were there, and they would actually produce themselves in spite of the various lines of defense that had been also built further inland. Now, there was undoubtedly a lesson to be learned about what the Germans accomplished on the Russians on the Eastern Front, but what could it be exactly for the West? There were naturally enormous questions at work, because this messed a bit with the failed so-called Schlieffen plan that, in fact, had produced the Western Front, but that was calibrated exactly to deal with Russia and France as well. We will talk about the various German plans, right, from von Moltke to the beginning of the First World War. Now, the German victories at Tannenberg, the Masurian Lakes, and the Gorlice-Tarnów offensive had convinced the British and the French that stalemate of trench warfare could be overcome by launching a breakthrough at a critical point in the enemy's front. A prospect that became their strategic objective for the remainder of the conflict, albeit accompanied by a persistent fear of becoming its victims at the same time. Always remember von Clausewitz's laws of reciprocity. Of course, the Germans, on the other side, even though they had been the ones scoring those successes in the East, were posing themselves the very same question in the West. The French national honor at this point especially dictated that the Huns be expelled from sacred homeland soil, given that they had invaded and the lines had of the trenches had consolidated, in fact, into French territory, making a relentless offensive the only practical option. In the German theater of war, the architects of those aforementioned successes, that were Generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich von Ludendorff, aided by the brilliant strategist Major Max Hoffmann, were rising stars within the German military elite. They advocated for a strategy intended to intensify the offensive against Russia in order to dismantle its resistance, thus knocking out of the war entirely such a big opponent that, in spite of its relative weakness, still in absolute terms did weigh a lot on the German military fort, as we will see now, also as far as the conflicting opinions within the same German high command. This would actually produce itself, as you know, in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution that had been helped by the same Germans that essentially shipped Lenin by train to back home, right, from exile. That would actually produce, this was not meant for the Germans to simply try, like they would keep doing, of course, a major breakthrough on the Western Front, but it would, for example, help the same Austro-Hungarians. It would put together enough forces that, for example, achieved the Battle of Caporetto, the victory at Caporet, that was not much an Austro-Hungarian, in fact, but a German, right? At least the main strategic and tactical insight was offered by the German division, der Stoßtruppen. We will look at the Italian front hopefully soon, because that's albeit a secondary one, also pretty relevant in terms of this broader economies of war from both sides. So the idea of keeping to press on Russia was quite supported at the time, since it could count on the political backing of influential figures such as the same Crown Prince Wilhelm and the Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg. However, the same Kaiser Wilhelm II placed unwavering faith in his chief of staff, the General Erich von Falkenhayn, who held a markedly different perspective. Von Falkenhayn was an experienced and skilled soldier, cold and pragmatic to the point of cynicism. He was actually of the same, actually fitting mold for leading that type of war at the time. If you make a comparison of all the main commanders-in-chief of the various armies involved, they all shared a bit this, at times, rigidity, but also cold blood, like an idea of, how order and discipline had to be maintained, that regardless of the butcher's myth was actually pretty effective. It also helped dramatically the general effectiveness of the armies. Regardless of the political issues we will see now, that had of course taken on a more moral and morale issue among the troops, and that are usually said like towards the later phase of the war some of these were removed, and because the attitude, if anything, of the high command had to change in front of the soldiers, there had been major political issues. It wasn't much of an actual military problem at all. Actually, some of these generals were removed were much better than the ones who came later. In any case, for von Falkenhayn, the insistence on attacking Russia made little sense. At best, he thought it could lead to pursuing the Russian armies across the vast landscape of that country without achieving any definitive results. This had been a problem in other times, historically, on which the same Tsarists had placed some of their hopes. We've seen it even in the War of the Third Coalition. That there is something, of course, logistically straining, of course, as the Germans would find out much more concretely 30 years later, operating in these vast as desolated Eastern European lands. True to this belief, von Falkenhayn proved to be rather stingy with reinforcements for his talented generals on the Eastern Front, because he was hierarchically in charge for that too, with imperial support, as well as obviously for the general balance of the German strategic effort. So you couldn't really take away something from one place and put it to another, not creating substantial issues. And given that von Falkenhayn's main effort, and the obliged one for Germany at the time, was in the West, giving greater resources to this Eastern operating generals meant to support another vision of the war that was partly conflicting with the one that von Falkenhayn, not just strategically but also politically, incarnated. This thus inadvertently, to a degree, limited those Eastern Front general successes and protected von Falkenhayn's own position at the top of the German armed forces. Despite how daunting it may seem, von Falkenhayn believed that the war could only be decided on the Western Front, and he was, of course, partially correct. This is always a relative statement. Like, of course, the main effort inescapably was the one on the Western Front, except, of course, more could be done in secondary theaters as well. There are many moral, political, cultural reasons for this that we discussed at length in other videos, and we sort of just began to address in a general way, but that are really crucial. For example, on the Western Front, the primary enemy was Britain, that de facto held France in a grip and used it as a weapon against Germany. Not that, of course, France did not have its own will, and especially a very strong anti-German one, but of course the French position depended heavily on Britain and on, of course, other external help than the United States. But Verdun is actually very important in its magnitude, because it really gave, as we will see now, a little spoiler, the French that sense of acceptance towards this terrible endurance that would, in fact, buy time for the Americans to arrive. Now, defeating France would automatically disarm Britain at the same time. That's why the British were involved to begin with. And again, I will not yet address, just to insult, by the way, this sort of, I don't know, hallucinatingly surreal idea that actual human beings seem to have nowadays, that Britain could or should have not entered the war because, I don't know, lots of British people died. We are at these levels of mental deficiency, which I'm not even going to address further. In any case, we will talk about that too even more. In any case, of course, the British at the time knew perfectly well how things were going, and a French defeat would have made it impossible for them to continue the war independently. And the German-Britain struggle was pretty real in a global sense. So it wasn't just, oh, we should have not crossed the channel, nothing would have happened. No, the Germans were, after all, just such a civilized people that wanted our own good, and there is nothing to see as just bad, it's evil militarist people, the butchers, the warmongers, etc. Like, this is the Fort Estaters mental disorder that we have to cope on a daily basis with today. Now, in contrast to the British and French generals, the Imperial German Chief of Staff lacked confidence in the feasibility of breaching the trench lines to return to a scenario of mobile warfare. This is also very interesting. It is true that particularly the British had at their disposal more resources to use in a third, in fact, more elastic way also around the world. This is how Churchill, for example, came up with tanks. Like, the idea was probably not just breaking through the trenches, but using essentially the Royal Navy on land. That was the vision behind that. And yet, not even that, actually, for the means of the time, did solve World War I. It's something that, in terms of skipping trench warfare, would occur only later from a doctrinal point of view. Now, the Germans were also much more, in that sense, much more limited to their continental reality. The fact that they were not such as especially with all the naval blockades and so on, that heavily affluent country. They were a big country, very strong one, also industrially speaking, demographically, but they had much less technology to spend in a broader sort of material throwaway sense. And so they understood that, as we will see now, of course, some technology could have been key to at least carrying out an attempt to break through the front. But of course, the solution had to be a bit more tactical. This is why the Germans were the ones who developed earlier the Stoßtruppen, especially on a larger scale. Actually, basically all countries were doing something similar, but of course, the Germans were the ones that, by strategic culture, etc., managed to have the military fundamentals to allow, for example, for a certain tactical autonomy to the officers. However, this is a topic that we'll have to dedicate many videos to. Also in this case, hopefully soon, because it's so crucial and it stems from the same Clausewitz and insight. In fact, already under von Falkenhayn's leadership, the German infantry was developing such new and aggressive assault tactics, relying on troops specifically trained for this purpose, known as the Stoßtruppen. Their ability to create breaches in enemy defensive systems through a combined use of traditional weapons such as infantry cannons and machine guns, alongside innovative tools like flamethrowers, could yield favorable results. The problem, though, is that, according to the same von Falkenhayn, these special troops were not the decisive factor underlying German superiority on the battlefield. Instead, according to him, the hopes of Germany were almost exclusively founded on artillery. This is a very important concept because you understand how from World War I onwards, artillery came to define contemporary warfare. We still see it today again. For example, in the war in Ukraine, you can't do without infantry. It's about, of course, seizing the terrain. You can dislodge the enemy from this if you cause enough casualties. But you shouldn't really believe that in the balance of war it's all about, say, that firepower and that essentially technological side of the story, even just, I don't know, a logistical and industrial one, right? War and the same Battle of Verdun proves over and over again that that's just a very powerful factor that, however, floats on the political and moral aspects of war that you can't really and simply dominate through a military equation and formula. And this is why we look at this 1916 doctrines after the couple of years of continuous fighting in the trenches as this almost intellective nesting into ideas that to an extent were tending towards abstraction even. Right, to a degree, as we said, nobody had ever fought this way, so nobody had ever tried these options. But militarily speaking, it's pretty unlikely that when you have a deadlock, right, things are simply bypassable through such a genius strike that magically solves the equation for which the enemy will be dumped to get himself killed in a disproportional manner and allowing you for victory. This is tendentially, I say tendentially because von Falkenhayn was not dumb, and definitely you're not more intelligent or capable than a World War I general, especially in these matters. But it was on, in fact, artillery that von Falkenhayn based his strategy for winning the war, right? We named the flamethrower. I think it's interesting just to digress briefly on it because, among the most terrifying things you can imagine on a battlefield, there is being burned alive. Yet it is exactly a feature of this period, and one that must be technically exposed. Now, the flamethrower was a newly conceived weapon that the Germans first deployed at Verdun. A flamethrower company consisted of 3 flamethrower platoons and a support platoon mounted on horse-drawn carts. Notice the contrast between, of course, most updated technologies and the good old means of moving war. Each flamethrower team was composed of non-commissioned officer and 3 soldiers, 2 of whom alternated in carrying the flamethrower bottle while one operated the nozzle through which the flammable mixture was released. The infiltration tactic employed by the Stoßtruppen involved penetrating the weak points of the enemy's deployment along a narrow front to strike deep behind enemy lines. However, in the absence of weak or more exposed points, the flamethrowers were tasked with creating such vulnerabilities. This sometimes necessitated advancing up to a kilometer into no man's land under enemy fire. We also tend to forget this aspect that even though trenches could be quite close, sometimes even tens of meters from one another, many advances were carried out across a very long road that was also normally destroyed by, again, the Verdun landscape is one of the most amazingly eloquent about this, that required all this heavy equipment, in fact, to be transported over mud, over craters, and being resupplied, right, also by people that had to make back and forth along the way. Needless to say, the flamethrower was particularly good at storming bunkers, which during the Battle of Verdun would constitute some of the most important objectives. The flamethrower tactics contemplated a pincer movement. One side included the fire from infantry, machine guns and artillery, while the other was provided by the flamethrowers themselves. As the combined fire kept the enemy line at bay, the flamethrower team advanced, aiming to reach as close as possible to the flanks of their opponents, within about 20 meters from them. With few bursts of flame, more could not be achieved, even if desired, by the technical limits of the device. They would have completed their task and paved the way for the main attack. However, the losses incurred during this type of operation were so severe that, despite the successes achieved, it was deemed prudent to limit the use of flamethrowers to specific situations, such as persuading the stubborn occupants of bunkers and other strongholds that were already isolated from the front line. In fact, there is a famous movie that I reviewed in which I was criticizing exactly the same point, that this French, in that case, flame throwers are brought just, with the soldiers standing above the German trench, like all orderly, nobody throwing grenades, nobody shooting, nothing, but just from the defensive side, waiting to be roasted alive. Of course, things were much more complicated. Otherwise, would have just used flamethrowers to unlock trench warfare, which of course was not the case. But back to the German plan, right? It was important to talk about flamethrowers because, of course, it's not like von Falkenhayn was an idiot that was not able to see like the tactical relevance of such innovations and knowing how to apply them doctrinally. But that's the point. Like, if you are one of those people who focuses on the narrow, tacticistical, individualistic issues, it means that you haven't the palest idea of what actual war actually is. It's a massive, gigantic, titanic wrestling, right, of moral and only secondarily physical forces in this scale. Millions of soldiers that are muscle to muscle in this massive strategic authority. That, of course, does not produce, like, just think, of course, like the average, I don't even know how to qualify this, thinking that, I don't know, machine gun fire can kill 30 people at a time if they advance, so every time somebody advances, loses 30 times more than, than the enemy. Even at this major offensive were always like in, pretty equal scale of losses, hundreds of thousands, and the entire point was of showing that, of course, actually, trench warfare tactics were. I can't even use the hyperbolical adverb to explain how successfully sophisticated they were, right? How incredibly intelligent, calibrated, complex, lucid, rational they were. They were a masterpiece of human civilization. The point, of course, is that they are played by both sides, and that's the result, right? So it's not much like the barbed wire or the machine gun that stops the offensive. The trenches were stormed, as we'll see now. This is the same at Verdun, the first line. Then the others, it's because there are soldiers that are defending them, and that's the element that we always tend to underplay, because we do not also want to put the emphasis on how much these peoples actually hated each other. I mean, you do not go at war like this if, this is just somebody telling you to do it on the point of a bayonet, right? In the history of civilization, we've seen that does not work. You must be motivated to do that, right? The myth of the butchers starts from this paranoid, lesser peoples, of course, delusion that, of course, they are the innocent and that just the evil elite are, superstitiously dominating. No, these people were fully convinced that they had to slaughter large masses of their adversary countries to achieve world domination and Germany. And frankly, like, if that's actually the general point, the problem is not much that you want to do this. That the problem is that, of course, there is somebody from the other side that is not simply complying, because you don't need necessarily to exterminate entire nations to achieve the goal of world domination. So that's actually where the whole thing gets down to. But back to the German plan for Verdun that von Falkenhayn first presented projectually in mid-December 1950, when it was actually intercepted already by the British through their spies. So it's not like the other side was not aware of this. This was presented during a meeting with army commanders and their chiefs of staff. Von Falkenhayn explained that a powerful blow against the French army would expose the internal weaknesses of the enemy nation and convince its people of the futility of continuing the war, thereby paving the way for French surrender. See the Clausewitzian paradigm repeated over and over again. Of course, as von Clausewitz explains, it's not like a general has to simply be a military man and not he's actually part of the same people. He's part of politics. The Clausewitzian trinity is everywhere, right? So the ultimate point, as the same von Falkenhayn explained during the offensive, was not even seizing anything. It was about, of course, breaking the enemy will to surrender, because war is an act of force aimed at compelling the enemy to fulfill your will. This is the Clausewitzian definition. So, in subsequent meetings, von Falkenhayn's ideas took increasingly precise form, because how do you actually bleed the French to the point of surrender, really, breaking their will as a major nation with an astonishingly proud military culture? Now, the first requirement was to identify a location that held such high symbolic value for the French that, as a bait, would compel them to defend it at all costs. As we'll see now, Verdun was very well chosen. Once a battlefield with these characteristics was selected, the German troops would threaten it without setting any territorial conquest objectives, whether limited or extensive. This point was fundamentally important because the French forces would need to be kept on their own defensive lines, essentially pinned down, subject to the destructive fire of artillery amassed against that target in an unprecedented concentration. Of course, von Falkenhayn had good reasons to think that this could be a way to break through. Again, you are not more capable than von Falkenhayn in planning a also very well executed plan in order to achieve major strategic results. The guy knew his deal, but you can immediately understand, of course, ex post we know how things went, so they actually went as von Falkenhayn contemplated, except for the French will to fight and to endure such tremendous losses. There is, however, a more subtly doctrinal point that is the same one we were making before, that is to say, how do you achieve this asymmetry at the end of the day? What war, that people think that there is such thing as asymmetric warfare, that's yet another indicator that you do not know absolutely anything about warfare, because warfare is always asymmetrical by definition, and the only thing that you are searching for throughout the entire war is to make it asymmetrical. In other words, to do something that the enemy hadn't seen coming, and that in a certain interest of time allows you to cause a certain amount of losses to him before he can adapt to the challenge, and so buying you some advantage for the further fight. This was the greater problem, because it's not like the French didn't know, aside from the fact they literally knew that this was the German intention, but it's like the Germans were actually threatening the places that the French in fact could not leave on their own, right? If the French had not concentrated there, the Germans, von Falkenhayn included, would have said, okay, let's move in, because that's, other boat terrain for free, right? Of course, this gap, this asymmetry is always understood in relative terms to the actual circumstances of. Actually, Verdun was a pretty closely and harshly fought battle. As we'll see now, there will be problems as far as, however, this doctrinal issue is concerned, because in spite of von Falkenhayn's plan and authority direction of the battle, it's not like all the officers were really agreeing with his view. Like, also down the line, there were aggressive behaviors that, in fact, were very much connected to precise moral, political, and cultural ideas, such as the ones that had loaded these peoples before the war, such as the fact, like in this case, that it was essentially like a Führer Teutonicus versus a Führer Gallicus, and so it was a matter of people, right, and peoples, in fact, fighting against one another, rather than subordinating you to artillery, which is to a material need, which is actually what I explained being one of the major ideas of Bolshevik ideology, paradoxically, like the subordinating the people to the means of production, that in any case are the literal machines, which is also how you destroy an entire people. This is the feature of essentially post-social world, people that are completely removed from any kind of awareness of what any minimal trace of tradition actually is. This continues for generations to come, because of course they were brutalized into this, but it spoke to the actual dehumanization, to the complete annihilation of humanity in this whole. So this was actually the problem that paradoxically was forming on the trenches, that prospectively it seemed as if, and look at von Falkenhayn's ideas, that cannons are more important than the actual people that is fighting with them. And so this is an incredibly demoralizing idea that also you can't quite contain. As we've seen in the video about the Freikorps, these people, again, really wanted to literally rip off other human beings in front of them. That was the actual thing. That's the most important thing in war. And so this sense of subordination was alienating, dehumanizing, and also betraying that promise of, being the superior race that was fully ingrained in all these people. So it's not a Nazi invention from, afterwards. If you box them in this reality in which you do not even give them like the due, like at least of the glory and the honor and the primacy, you are actually committing a pretty strong sin, right? And of course, this was in part what had been. This is a consequence, first of all, of mass societies and the post-traditional essentials. Even though Germany, of course, was one of the last great empires at the time, it's not like it hadn't, like all the others, degenerated over the centuries. And of course, it is true that there was a culture of, okay, these are just numbers, right? Throw them into the meat grinder. One that, in turn, however, in a strictly technical sense, you must also understand, coming from this paradox that had balanced everything, right? Von Falkenhayn, also by character, was a pretty sort of picky, harsh, cold individual. Again, very good for this kind of job, because he was also very good, in fact, at it. But the inherent problem of envisioning the role of infantry as merely supplementary to that of artillery is, in a war that should have been fought allegedly on the racial superiority of this or that people, actually a pretty great deal of a problem. According to von Falkenhayn and his plan, the infantry would have had to maintain contact with the French forces, forcing them into tight spaces, ideal targets for artillery shells, and would also protect the forward observers who directed the fire of the artillery batteries. Consider, during some moments of the battle, there would be some parts of the line that would witness the fall of a shell every 10 square meters in an hour, which is utterly insane. Millions, of course, were shot, especially concentrated during the first day, because that would, as we'll see now, wipe literally out like the first French lines of defense. So look at this word upside down again. The observer that fundamentally is served by line infantry and not vice versa, right? And this was also contrary to German manuals that advocated for assaults conducted to achieve success at any cost. This was present pretty much in all the World War I national doctrines. Von Falkenhayn instead tasked infantry with limiting themselves to merely threaten the chosen objective without ever genuinely committing to its capture, which is yet another counterintuitive and essentially counter-strategic idea, right? If you have an advantage, if you're the stronger one, you actually punch frontally and hard. That's what makes anyone strong, if they can afford to do this, right? This sense of I just show up and I sort of act as if I want to attack you, but I don't, is not quite per se just an ideal situation. Of course, you're trying to base the enemy into something, you're trying to fix them somewhere, but this is virtually what is going to happen anyway once you move also this immense amount of forces, like all the logistical. So there was no real surprise for anyone involved, right? If anything, it was how willing you are to die for a single piece of dirt, because that's where it gets down to, rather than actually why you're carrying out this the strategy or not. And so in this way, through a simplistic calculative approach, the numerical balance of losses between the two sides could only favor the German troops, who would, at least in theory, who would essentially serve as bait in this gigantic trap, or a sort of infernal meat grinder designed to literally bleed France to death. Now, by the second week of January 1916, Falkenhayn had completed a thorough examination of potential locations to execute his plans, ultimately selecting the fortified complex of Verdun. Here, the Meuse River formed a narrow bend at the foot of the Vosges Mountains, with the French lines intruding into German lines and creating a sort of peninsula surrounded on three sides, technically referred to as a salient, which was perfect for concentrating artillery bombardments in limited areas. More critically, however, Verdun held a great moral, historical, and political meaning, because it was a border area over which the French and the Germans had fought for centuries. Even more especially, the last significant clash in the area occurred during the Franco-Prussian War, when the French experienced a humiliating defeat in that specific battle in the war. So an open wound still in their national pride, even after more than 40 years. Just 40 years before? Yes, consider it. There were generals, say, born in the 1840s that were pretty pre-active there. So imagine the mentality, the background from which they emerged, also in terms of the Franco-German conflict, brutally meant. The fact that the French had lost a significant amount of territory on that occasion that he wanted to regain. There is, of course, all the kind of chagrin and revanchism that is typical of that era. Although the area of Verdun had been fortified by the French, of course, this would only provide them with an illusory sense of security, further entrenching their commitment to its defense. That is essentially what the Germans want, as we observed. So, from a purely technical and military standpoint, the fact that Verdun was a salient surrounded on three sides by German forces significantly facilitated the strategic plan devised by the German commander. So again, it's not just about this advantage that should have been sold, mostly through artillery, because again, how would von Falkenhayn achieve that asymmetry? Well, as we'll see now, the Germans had pretty damn good guns, right? And not just many of them, but properly surpassing the French ones in quality. So that was, and there was a rapid, as you know, industrial technical development that the German industry at this point was focusing on, exactly to deliver that unprecedented concentration of fire, which in fact nobody had any idea of how it actually work out, and it would even work out pretty darn well, right? Except that wouldn't be enough to create sufficient asymmetry to bleed France wide. In fact, von Falkenhayn assigned the task of bleeding the French nation to these over 1,600 artillery pieces of the 5th Army, that is the one that would fight at Verdun, which were primarily concentrated against a portion of the salient that was just 1,000 kilometers wide. So that gives you an idea of fire concentration. It's insane. We will see now also what kind of pieces were used. About a third of these, in fact, consisted of light field guns with a caliber of 7.7 centimeters and light howitzers with a caliber of 10.5 centimeters. These were part of the infantry divisions. The remaining pieces were significantly heavier, however, including long-range cannons with calibers up to 21 centimeters, as well as siege howitzers and mortars with a maximum caliber of 42. Arranged in a semicircle around the salient, these artillery pieces could concentrate their fire while remaining sufficiently dispersed to evade easy targeting by the enemy that was the one to be instead much more concentrated. This also marked the first time that aviation would contribute in a coordinated manner to both spotting ground targets and tracking down enemy reconnaissance efforts. There was, in fact, a backlash from the French side that managed at some point even to clear the skies from the German air. Made a video about Manfred von Richthofen, by the way. As we were hinting at before, von Falkenhayn was actually right about the performance of the German heavy artillery. Right? Their effectiveness was significantly superior to that of the French shells, and they had a higher rate of fire due to their more modern design. So the confidence in the arm was very well reposed. Furthermore, and perhaps even more importantly, their numbers were distinctly greater than those of their adversaries. Never underestimate number as an actual factor as well. Now, this overwhelming advantage in artillery allowed von Falkenhayn to anticipate that the Fifth Army would possess sufficient firepower not only to execute its destructive strategy, but also to withstand the expected French counterattacks, which hopefully would have been, in fact, lured into this even heavier hellfire and even more easily eliminated. Crushing any resistance was undoubtedly a very labor-intensive plan from a logistical and organizational perspective. The idea was to literally destroy especially everything that was in the first line of defenses, which also had never actually been done. There had been some precedents to this, but the results had not been so utterly devastating like the ones of Verdun. When you look at von Falkenhayn's plan, it was fundamentally linear and straightforward, grounded in a solid strategic concept. That's how plans should be conceived. So that was actually an advantage of this. If it ultimately failed, as we were pointing out before, it was not due to specific technical reasons, not even of the plan, not even for how the battle articulated itself, because the same von Falkenhayn, as we explained, did not even want the Germans to seize that area to begin with. Right, the most important thing was to bleed the French white, to kill as many of them as possible under that bombardment. They would have endured not to let the Germans walk in. The real reason why it would fail was a cultural one. And not just in terms of the French resolve, but for dynamics that we hinted at before going on within the same German army, where no one, from Crown Prince Wilhelm, the commander-in-chief of the very Fifth Army, was supposed to implement the plan, to the individual whom Kaiser Wilhelm II had designated as the military advisor, who was actually a true overseer, that is the chief of staff of the army, Konstantin Schmidt von Knobelsdorff, and down to the last of the battalion commanders shared von Falkenhayn's vision. That it was truly innovative, it was truly visionary, and unprecedented, but especially distant from the meaning that that war and the means with which it had to be fought had been founded, had been conceived to begin the same war. Raised within the myth of territorial conquest and victory at all costs, the career military officers were unwilling to accept a subordinate role in relation to artillery. It was insulting to them. It was something you couldn't take, right? The disproportionality of losses for such motivations is actually under everybody's eyes, even in today's Ukraine, for example, right? Both from an offensive and a defensive point of view. And that's the Clausewitzian paradigm, right? War is truly just a continuation of politics with other means. You cannot understand why two peoples can slaughter one another in an apparently senseless massacre if you do not understand what's behind that, right? How they think, how they see one another, what they actually want. You've been indoctrinated in this nonsense that who wants war in general, who fights war, or finds himself in war and wants to fight it, for that matter, is just a warmonger, or someone that is inherently evil, or that is, I don't know, illogical or impractical, is just an idiot that's getting himself killed for no reason whatsoever. This way of thinking betrays a heavy illiteracy in any cultural, in any strategic culture, but also, in fact, in a broader historical, political sense. I mean, if you still don't understand this, according to you, why were wars ever fought? That's where, again, yes, we know lesser people come up with the superstition of the elite that control everything, but surprisingly, civilization develops and lesser people live always better, but nobody knows why, right, according to these logics. Of course, we do not even take that into consideration. We have history, and this tragedy, this absolute bloodbaths that resonate to this day, even if not to change very much, like also in the practice of how people do it over and over again, for us to study, if anything, to study, right, and hopefully to understand, and just maybe later to moralize upon, right? You must, first of all, and then you will be able to, because of course there is always somebody who sort of screws up, where another that did this for, maybe not good reason. This has nothing to do with the licity, also at least the cost-benefit ratio involved. There's no doubt that some choices are disastrous and bring to nothing, and others instead, more rarely, are actually good. Like war is the rashest of the solutions, and just sometimes it turns out to begin with to be actually the best path. But yet that war has to be fought. It's not just an option, it's switch something on and it goes by itself. You have to actually fight, otherwise there wouldn't even be a war, right? And that's where the concept of conflict, that you must never confuse with the one of war, comes into play. It's all this background, it's all this view from both sides. And I think about this from the German soldiers' perspectives. They did not wish to limit themselves to occupying the debris produced by artillery shells without firing a shot. It wasn't even about saying, you see, according to this sort of pauperistically pathetic idea that the poor soldier was, I don't know, sharing photos with the enemies or whatever, this kind of mentality. These people weren't even content by a plan like von Falkenhayn was telling them, look, we're just being the enemy in a certain place, we're going to slaughter the hell out of him, and then you will just have to walk in and you will actually suffer less loss. And no. These people wanted to go out there and kill the enemy with their own hands. Do you understand that? This is This is what humans are. This is not the BS of, oh my god, a war, such a terrible thing. They were just brought there because somebody evil at the top brought them to do. No, they wanted to rip off the intestines of the people in front of them. This is actual war. Otherwise, there is no war. I don't know how to explain this to you. There is no such thing like something happening without the decisive moral majority of the people, politically wise. This is the point, that these soldiers aimed to demonstrate that the infantry still deserved its status as the queen of the battlefield, owing to the tactical innovations that the crown prince himself had championed and supported. The Kaiser was the one who had told to the Germans that they had to terrorize their enemies, that they had to be seen as the Huns. Right? You have mentally deficient kids today that say, oh my god, what a terrible thing to call the Germans the Huns. I've heard it's something that, our terrible people, like from the other side, said about the Germans. They actually placed it on themselves willingly because they must terrorize their opponents with the awareness, of course, of the Hunnic blood in their veins. And that kind of savage idea that was shown in the Netherlands, in bombing London and more. But this is, of course, like what other peoples did to a degree. Never underestimate the Germany up to 1 century before was still a feudal country, and all the sort of hierarchical mentality that came from that. Also for how people down the line were considered. So when you wonder how, again, even today, hundreds of thousands of people can get themselves killed without apparently blinking an eye in a broader political or national sense, just know that it is a thing. There are some people that are okay with this. Also, not for flattering reasons. One thing is being threatened by annihilation. That's a very good reason to, at least try to survive by fighting back. Another thing is simply throwing people to the meat grinder, saying, because objectively in some countries people's lives is objectively cheaper, right? And that's obvious. If you are not into the rigid hierarchy of cultural superiority and inferiority, you can never understand this. If you're not there, just know that you do not know any history. You do not know any country. You have a fantasy, fictional, feministic understanding of the world, dominated by emotions and sort of any lack of control on your instincts. Reality is something very different, and war actually is very much framed within this rigid box. It's an incredibly technical, lucid, and actually the single most rational endeavor, at least as an instrument of politics, that directs this. You're not better than people that make war for the reasons that you would unflinchingly support yourself if you were brought up with those mentalities. And so it was a matter of honor, right? These people went at war with a mentality that was almost Napoleonic in terms of the identity of the regiments and the sort of even local, for example, think Germany in a federal sense, how single units still reflected that even pre-unification world in a way that was that all the pride connected to all these choices and the hierarchy and the Reich and the general status of Germany, of course, internationally, it's all intertwined. All right. Prince Wilhelm was among the first to support 2 experimental units aimed at addressing the tactical challenges of trench warfare. They were for the, again, tactical solution, the Sturmbataillon, the Assault Battalion Nummer 5 Röhr, which served as the original nucleus of the Stoßtruppen devised by, in fact, Captain Willy Rohr, and the pioneering battalion of the Guard, made up of reserve firefighters in civilian life. Consider this from a psychological point of view. Were testing the initial models of flamethrowers. We're trying really to find a solution to trench warfare starting from this down the line dimension, which was not even necessarily, in fact, it was essentially fallimentary. They wouldn't make it, right? They would be able to achieve a lot through that, but not just specifically the Germans lost the war, but no other country, of course, used this in the same way surpassed trench warfare, right? And so when you compare this to the higher, more rigid hierarchical von Falkenhayn's vision, you realize that there are two different worlds. In fact, this princely one, you can argue, was more aiming at the people's consensus rather than at a colder, strategical, heartless, but perhaps more effective dimension that would actually accomplish much of its military objectives. The prince's connection to the aforementioned experimental units and his first-hand knowledge of their capabilities, because he was very involved in these experiments, provided him with a dramatically different perspective on trench warfare compared to von Falkenhayn as well. This viewpoint was shared also by his officers, who trained their men according to the new tactical principles while still pursuing the traditional objectives of capturing territory through the overwhelming force of close quarter attacks. So there were pros and cons, actually, but they were unequal in value. And imagine having, in fact, a commander-in-chief that plans an offensive alongside this foundation of artillery superiority and of essentially no territorial conquest needed, and a general, that the army, like the forces that are going to be used, that in their own hierarchical organization think in essentially different ways. Something will go wrong because of this. I mean, people died because of this as well. The German offensive at Verdun commenced on the morning of February the 21st, 1960. At 8:12 a.m., the Crown Prince himself ordered the artillery to open fire. With the exception of brief pauses to send patrols to ascertain the effects of the bombardment, the shelling continued throughout the entire day. Reports from both ground and aerial reconnaissance were unanimous, confirming that the destruction of the French front line was virtually complete. Again, unprecedented. They calculated it. They were right. They wiped the hell out the French front line. The only French soldiers encountered were either fleeing or surrendering, stunned and demoralized by the explosive fury. Few pockets of French resistance remain, such as the Chasseurs Alpins at Bois de Corps, was the site of pretty hellish confrontation. In fact, they held out for 2 days despite being decimated by bombardments. Think what kind of example this was for the rest of the French army. This is the definition of heroism, when you sacrifice yourself in order to show the rest that it can be done, and what kind of consequences this has in the brain of a person. On the second day, the role of artillery shifted from destroying the enemy to suppressing them, because they basically shot millions. All right, and after this, the point was, it was like they didn't have, of course, any capacity to maintain the same rhythm as before. But of course, like we've explained many times in many videos about missile warfare, of course, that the most important strategic effect you can have is, even if you shoot the same amount of projectiles over a certain amount of time, whether this is concentrated in a portion of that time or scattered throughout. Right, and the first one is exponentially more devastating in a military sense, because it's not much about the physical destruction. It's about the moral breakdown. You can't take just so much in interest of time, and if you are traumatized in that concentrated fashion, then it doesn't really matter to what you're exposed later. You're done for, right? So at this point, it was probably about unhinging the very fabric of the French fortification, annihilating the troops that were there. After that, of course, the survivors were to be kept down, and lower volume of fire was okay. So the role of artillery at this point was to prevent the enemy from regaining abandoned positions, mostly, while the infantry, the German infantry, was to advance to occupy them. So it's not like, of course, that the Germans were baiting the French into this just by showing at a distance, say, we're going to come there, watch out. Now, of course, they were to advance, and of course, had the French simply gone away, the same von Falkenhayn would have been okay with that. Just it was not it was just a secondary objective, if anything. The first one was to kill as many French people as possible. This was the second day. Between 8 a.m. and noon, the 9 divisions of the 5th German Army advanced with precise synchronization, as the artillery adjusted its fire just enough to minimize the risk of mistakenly hitting friendly forces. It was very well, almost mathematically calibrated. Everything had been very well planned. And it was also a matter of seconds. Like, most defenders were caught off guard thanks to this precision, still huddled in their shelters, for example, waiting for the bombardment to cease. So this was actually a masterpiece of strategic planning and execution at the same time. As a result, on February 25th, the famed Fort Douaumont was occupied through a surprise attack extending well 10 kilometers beyond the initial starting line. It's important to talk about Fort Douaumont, not just because the most important clash of Verdun was there, but also because of the meaning of the place, its organization, its defense. It gives you an idea of how devastating the same German bombardments have been. As we saw before, Verdun was a fortified region, and before the attack, it had a perimeter of approximately 45 kilometers, characterized by low ridges formed by the foothills of the Vosges Mountains. It consisted of a double ring of 28 forts, some major, such as, in fact, the Fort Douaumont, and numerous lesser structures. The defensive project dated back to the great military architect of Louis XIV, Sébastien Le Prince de Vauban. I made a video about him this summer. You can check that out. I also created a 17th century. It's valid also for the 18th, for telling the truth, playlist. And talked about Louis XIV's army. Will come back on that soon, right? So these were places that the French had fortified from quite a long time historically to protect the same country, but also acting as launch pads for invading the Rhineland, like at the time the Sun King did. Because of the ongoing Franco-German conflict throughout the centuries, various structures have been continuously updated and reinforced in such a strategic location. Most recently, connecting trenches had been added between each fort to provide continuity to the defenses. In anticipation of the battle, the fortifications relied on a garrison of 66,000 men, equipped with about 1,000 cannons. So we see in the same scale of the Germans. However, many of the larger caliber guns had been redirected elsewhere, also because the salient contained in itself the risk that this pieces could be lost due to a German encirclement, and were not comparable to the German artillery in terms of range and power either. So the French actually had a significant disadvantage there, in spite being on the defensive. Once the objective of pulverizing the opposing front line with artillery was achieved, the German infantry was thus able to proceed to occupy it. And the coordination between artillery fire and infantry advancement had to be perfectly synchronized, as we've seen, to avoid friendly fire casualties. The cannon fire had to be gradually extended, preceding the movement of the troops. Meanwhile, other batteries would strike deeper, so to keep the enemy busy, targeting areas behind the zone to be occupied to prevent the influx of reinforcements and contain anticipated enemy counterattacks. This two-phase scheme was intended to be executed in a coordinated manner. The German infantry would primarily limit themselves to occupying territory that was already nearly free of enemies, thereby incurring only minimal losses compared to those inflicted on the French. It's a bit of an ideal issue. At least the Germans would take significant casualties also at the beginning in absolute terms, but compared to the French, definitely things started excellently for the Fifth Army. Now, against the most advanced lines of the French defenses, the tactic achieved considerable success. All German divisions reached their predetermined objectives practically without encountering opposition, to such an extent that many unit commanders requested and received permission from von Knobelsdorff to enhance their positions by advancing even a few hundred meters to reach a ridge or to narrow their front, so that at least the artillery would be warned of this repositioning, that just from the spot had been assessed to be more advantageous. However, this marked in itself the very grain of sand that jammed von Falkenhayn's apparently perfect mechanism. Let's understand better why. Emboldened by their early successes, so they literally had proven that this artillery was fantastic, and so the Germans had walked in to the French positions, essentially finishing off what was remained of the enemy. The German commanders ordered their troops to continue the advance beyond the initially planned objectives in order to secure further territorial gains, which, as we have seen, was something that von Falkenhayn had not envisaged or wanted to begin with. This decision led to two immediate consequences. On one hand, the Germans, this was an issue that really every advancing army at the time had experienced, including the same Germans, for example, at the Battle of the Marne, etc., advanced beyond the effective range of their artillery. Of course, in that situation, things were strategically and logistically different from this one. This was much better prepared. Still, however, and paradoxically so, this bombardment had been so devastating and successful that the Germans had not calculated by advancing so easily, they would have not been able to keep up with the artillery reposition. On the other hand, they also began to draw too close to the French troops that were still stubbornly resisting on the ground, as well as those who were arriving as reinforcements. So it's basically the same identical problem, puzzle that trench warfare had always posed, just to a different degree, considering the terrain, considering the numbers, this arrangement of forces. As a result, German artillery lost much of its utility. It's not that it was really useless or nullified by this convenience, but on one side it struggled to avoid hitting its own men, and this should have been envisaged, because whichever counterattack would have occurred, yes, it should have been bombarded by the same Germans in defense, but as we've seen, that cultural problem within the cadres had been bringing the troops to advance more than von Falkenhayn had wanted, and there was a really a veritable iron arm within the German army, and say probably the entire conduct of the war. As you understand, there were many political issues at stake, and this artillery thus needed to advance to keep pace with the unplanned progress of the front, so disrupting those meticulous calculations that had previously been carried out to regulate this perfectly. There's much attrition actually in this all. Many cannons were too heavy even to maneuver over the cratered and muddy terrain that they had themselves created in that instability, in that softness. In some spots, the terrain had literally boiled, which is a phenomenon that at the time was known just occurring during certain earthquakes, and that nobody had ever witnessed up to this level of shells concentration. And the same is true for the logistical train, as we pointed out before, that supplied them with ammo. So if one were to objectivize what happened, it's essentially that, yes, they had shocked, essentially they had used a more powerful mean of the kind that had always been used in trench warfare. So this could cause a temporary shock that, yes, was aimed to cause greater losses among the enemy, but at the same time, it had not been enough to unhinge this major resistance that was one of entire nations at war. And so that could and would not just bring to total collapse just for a greater pace of carnage, as this one was. I'd actually describe some of these German monster artillery. One is the 21 centimeters Mörser. These 21 centimeter heavy howitzer had a maximum effective range of 9 kilometers, which became evident during the initial phases of the German attack, when the German troops achieved an advance of approximately 6 kilometers. These guns had to be redeployed forward, providing too heavy to maneuver on the ground they themselves had disrupted. Then there is the 21 Schnellladekanone, that is to say the quick-loading cannon Peter Adalbert. This was a naval-designed long-range quick-firing cannon that had its very baptism of fire at Verdun. It was capable of firing up to 6 rounds per minute at a maximum range of 26 kilometers. Weighing around 110 tons, it necessitated transportation by railway car. However, given the size of its projectiles, which weighed something like 110 kilograms, 1/10 of the cannon itself, and the rate at which they were expended, it would of course be impossible to move it far from a rail terminal. Then you have the 38 centimeters Schnellladekanone 1/45, the Langer Max. This had a barrel length of 16 meters and a weight of nearly 270 tons. And this piece earned the nickname of Langer Max, this is Max the Long. Preparing a sufficiently durable platform and positioning it required a month's time. And although its maximum range was close to 50 kilometers, its effective one was reduced to about half when using its 750 kilogram projectiles with a high destructive potential. Finally, we have the M-Gerät 14, 42 centimeters Kurze Marine-Kanone, better known as the Dicke Bertha, the Fat Bertha, that is also undoubtedly the most famous of the German artillery pieces from World War I. These were all, excellences of German engineering. This tells you how, yes, of course, advanced Germany was, especially as far as, blood and iron was concerned. And its notoriety, of course, is tied to its caliber, 42 centimeters, and the weight of its projectiles, 820 kilograms. Right, and as a howitzer, its firing distance was intermediate between that of cannons and mortars, so approximately 12 kilometers. You understand that, of course, for the general distances involved at Verdun, like bringing these pieces in the proximity of the salient, would have provided an important coverage. However, again, that millimetrically, a bit hyperbolically, organized plan would have been disrupted in the moment in which the troops would have, aside from general cultural issues as we define them today, of course, would have moved into places that would have not been easily predictable. Consider how disorienting the ground can become after you have wiped like literally everything that lays on it. Communication, of course, exists, but reconstructing things takes time, and you can't quite know exactly all the time what was going on. It's not like the French are sleeping, they're bombing back in spite of their disadvantage. So that actually, in spite of the Battle of Verdun, as we've seen, lasted 10 months, the effects of this German bogging down began to manifest since the third day. So basically for other 300 days it would go on, when essentially the initial plan, that of course you update over time, you adapt to the situation, but had in principle already been disrupted. Right? Things had not been what von Falkenhayn himself had hoped. Essentially, the French reinforcements, first of all, had arrived during the night, and they had found no trench to occupy. Because, as we just pointed out, every tree, every shell hole, and every pile of rubble became a makeshift trench, regardless of how, in fact, proper trenches would have ideally been, which did complicate the situation because the French forces were now all scattered, which is definitely not great for them, but as far as those powerful artillery barrages were concerned, you couldn't quite concentrate them too much on a place you can't even essentially identify. You can't give the coordinates, but as we've seen, this have become dangerous. Of course, there was a degree of course, imprecision that would risk to hit the same Germans that had become entangled into this veritable hell of irregular terrain without many points of reference to begin with. The French naturally were pretty angry because of the general situation, and they also were endowed with a specific stubbornness at this point, because also what had been happening, for how relevant Verdun was for them. So the aforementioned ruins used by the defenders became synonymous with France herself. This is a pretty poignant concept to begin with. They were defended with desperate courage and frenzied determination. In a situation that, remember, is really collapsing. The Germans had been sort of the most offensive, the bulkier, the sturdier side, right? And so now that they had even achieved this partial breakthrough, the enemy defenses scrambling the French and making them fully realize that the emergential situation, like it's not like Verdun was also, regardless of these issues occurring within the German army, just about, okay, the Germans should have not broken through anyway. No, this was actually a great problem along the front, right? The French here were to stop an enemy that could have broken through their lines entirely and had the front collapsing. So the motivation behind this was deeply understood. The French had already experienced that in many battles since the very beginning of the war. The same Paris was being threatened. It was an incredibly critical situation. So France got really the best of herself deployed in this defense. And such a noble cause, in fact, justified every excess, as every method used to compel the troops to sacrifice was deemed permissible, including executions for the slightest sign of wavering and senseless counterattacks as well. So, of course, the French had, in fact, their Martinet mentality that was actually very effective at this point. I mean, of course, as you know, especially in 1917, there would be lots of strikes across Europe. People were getting tired as a whole. But these good old, ruthless military means are, especially when employed una tantum, pretty concrete effects, right? And, you know, literature and cinema are rich in this. If you pick the classics, aside from, again, the whiny, complaining narrative of essentially mostly World War II time, at least post-contestation time, you should say better, at least until the 60s. The 70s, things were relatively normal in this regard, but they also wouldn't show too much of the more cruel aspect of the war that also existed, except you don't have to bend them to some sort of communistic propaganda, which is the actual problem. This is also, of course, World War I, and here we're talking about disciplinary measures, but of course what was happening in the front line between the French and the Germans is something that goes beyond any description. The same executions French soldiers provided, let's say, the moral energy, not only for combat, but for extraordinary efforts, such as the logistic train organized by General Philippe Pétain, that became also much more relevant in later history. Joffre was the commander-in-chief of the French side. Along the so-called Voie Sacrée, that is the sacred road, which ensured the continuous flow of reinforcements and supplies to Verdun throughout the battle. Remember, at the Marne there were the Paris taxis that were used to bring the troops to the front. Everything available. Here, France was really, taking serious hits and striking back incredibly hard, with precise demarcation lines between one field and another, trenches serving this purpose as well. Sometimes it's the only recognizable feature to a degree. Also, they're dug in the ground. You can't even see them that well. The destructive task of artillery would prove significantly more challenging. The skeletal remains of trees obstructed a clear view of the targets. Some were wooded areas indeed. And Allied aviation began to vigorously counter the German aerial reconnaissance that, as we said before, had been for the first time employed in a really coordinated way with the German fort, meaning that, of course, you know that military aviation had been born primarily for reconnaissance reasons. Then, as we've seen in the video about the Red Baron, things began to escalate to, in fact, escort these observers that up to this point had been acting in a scattered way, and that von Falkenhayn instead had managed now to scientifically use in a very concerted fashion to systematically gain information about the French position to target with this monstrous German artillery. In any case, this was the point, that on the ground, the cost was far too high for the Germans. As the days passed, the objective of gaining ground became increasingly difficult. They had this major hit at the beginning because they had better guns. This is literally how it went. Also, they had more. And then, yes, they advanced with low losses, but then they stopped in the same identical way that Western Front had been showing in the last years. During the first week of fighting, that is from February the 21st to the 27th, the Germans had advanced in successive leaps, but after the latter date, their progress slowed markedly. The same nerves of the German commanders began to fray. But you think it's just from the defensive side that things pressure you the most. No. Here, crushing the enemy's resistance had been, as we've seen, a point of pride, one of competition within the same ranks of the German forces. This was pushing the Germans in an equally and opposite way to the determination demonstrated by the French. Thus, the Verdun fightings escalated in a vicious way. Orders were issued to attack, quote, without any regard for casualties. This is what you remember. This is the allegedly, or at least allegedly innovative or modernizing. These are the innovative sounding, the more down to earth, down to the people kind of mentality. These evil generals do not know what they're doing. We have to find the ways to solve this. We have to bring the men forward. Advance without any regard for casualties. They wanted it themselves. Von Falkenhayn had, of course, he was pushing for this in the sense that, again, you must advance, you must also defend from the counterattacks, etc. This is going to happen anyway. But there was something about the Germans that had devoted themselves to this aggression and territorial conquest that they had to prove. Also to von Falkenhayn to show that his ballet kind of idea was not matching with the brutal, rigid, inflexible German spirit of attack and aggression. So progress at this point was no longer measurable in tens of kilometers. Like in the first day, even probably against the most, even the same plans, like the most pink hopes, let's say, had been achieved, but rather in meters, each one seized at the cost of countless human lives on both sides. Again, there are some locations that are basically switching in possession one side to the other, a striking, because that's why the entire terrain is so messed up still today, because it was that heavily concentrated and that salient. On July 11th, Prince Wilhelm ordered his divisions to cease all offensive actions. In other words, it was back to positional warfare. One major reason was indeed the fact that the British had initiated their Somme offensive, also to release their allies from this immense German pressure that was still risking to crack them. Thus, all available resources, at least the ones that could be distracted while still maintaining the Verdun offensive going, were to be directed to the Somme. That was another hell of a battle. We'll make surely a bit about this. Now, von Falkenhayn had achieved, of course, his major goal of, in a strictly military sense, of bleeding France dry. Because 400,000 French soldiers were dead, wounded, taken prisoner, or otherwise out of action. It was an immense figure, right? However, there is not just the military side of the story. It was also actually not fully satisfactory. In fact, contrary to von Falkenhayn's hopes, it was not solely artillery that had produced this result. Infantry had also played a significant role with pretty heavy German losses at the same time. And in fact, we're talking, as we said at the beginning, price paid by the Germans almost equally high, proving that, yes, asymmetry could maybe initially be accomplished, but the technical means were definitely not the answer. It is about the resolve of people that makes things happen. And there is no way to simply unhinge the numbers. You see, again, defense, offense, more or less the same kind of losses. By the way, the ordeal was far from over, because this is in summer, and the French, by this time, had taken the initiative themselves and launched a counterattack, managing to reclaim the now, in fact, emblematic Fort Douaumont on October the 24th. Albeit after immense effort, but still basically at the end of the battle. And this was a hell of a symbolical achievement for France, for the entire nation, basically telling the Germans, you can't pass, right? And we are going to recover what is ours. And this is the freaking thing. This is what makes Verdun essentially a French moral victory at least, because in spite of the losses, the actual resolve of the French rose after this battle. So if, of course, the butchery, the Ermattungsstrategie, so the attrition strategy, Ermattung stands for probably like butchering people like animals, right, in large quantities, and which is exactly what von Clausewitz says war gets down to in practice, and that's what you do when you're very strong. And so everything was going exactly in the right military direction, but from the other side you find the same strength, and actually in a political way, which is what you get from the military outcome of this, the French people reacted with enormous pride and great admiration, of course, for their troops at the front, so boosting their morale further. Of course, this was a pretty bleak moment. The French really took this monstrous amount of losses. It was an incredibly grim moment. There are some passages from the memoir, from the documentation. It's utterly shocking, something unbelievable what was happening there. So it's not like they were that relieved by the fact that the Battle of Verdun had happened. But it made them understand that if that was the new normal, they were able to withstand that. And that is the indicator of resolve. This helped to win the war in a way that can't be quite calculated because it's moral forces, but conventionally we can easily understand how important it was. The failure of von Falkenhayn's strategy cost his position as Chief of Staff of the Imperial German Army. After the failure of Verdun, there was nothing really that he could do that much. Like the one that would benefit from von Falkenhayn's removal was another famous name that is mentioned before, another internal rival of his, Paul von Hindenburg. That would be so important in German history, also in the rise of Hitler, etc. Now, despite this change in leadership and the significant advancements made in infantry tactics, the German army wouldn't learn from the lessons of Verdun. This is really an important aspect because, again, this was not actually a military failure strictly meant. Right, as always, why would we say that the thing that war is the continuation? Because it's not like war exists in a realm that is separated from the rest. You make war because, again, you want to convince the enemy that it's worthless to continue fighting, and it's not like von Falkenhayn's strategy was wrong. It's just it had not changed that much in, say, innovative terms of what could or couldn't be done in this deadlock that required hundreds of thousands of people to die in order to achieve anything, and so not even much in terms of the balance between the two sides. But because in fact there had been this enormous reaction from the French side that were fighting in the same way. And this was a problem for the Germans because it's obvious that when von Falkenhayn was removed, his ideas were essentially thrown away, right? The aforementioned Ermattungsstrategie was actually the right one during World War I. I mean, nobody would actually move away from that in practice. The German army was so dissatisfied with what had happened and also traumatized from their side, from the horrors of Verdun, that they essentially dismissed. They said, okay, this is how the war is fought, yes, but we must find a solution. We have to invest more, as we've seen in the Stoßtruppen. We have to find essentially an eminently tactical solution rather than a strategic or more comprehensive one. And this wouldn't help them on the longer run, all right? This way of knocking out lots of people and to essentially hope in that bleeding the enemy white was the best solution was at least ideal and say directionally the right one. Now the means how to achieve that were difficult as Verdun provided, but the principle was not wrong. Now, exactly in this clash of will, the idea that you couldn't quite simply bend the French, not even by killing hundreds of thousands of their men, had sort of made the Germans thinking, okay, well, we're not going to make yet another fort like that because, as we've seen, it didn't work. No, that would have been actually the right thing. It's more of a moral issue. That's, in fact, what war is prevalently. But it's as if the staticity of the front, this is very important also for today's lessons, had simply made us say, okay, nothing is really changing, isn't it? Everything was changing. Every time hundreds of thousands of people die, something changes enormously. It's not just a bunch of fidgets like, thrown there on the battlefield. Those are actual people. There are people at home that are waiting for their return. There are parents, there are children, there are spouses. And what happens to them is something that will shape the entire world around. So that's actually the most powerful thing you can do. It's not about okay, it's a waste. It isn't a waste. Because that's actually the most effective way to test who is the strongest and continuing until it's over. If you don't keep up with that, you can't quite win. And this is quite interesting because, of course, the Germans had a hell of that. They were in many ways fighting, say, not alone, but they were, as we've seen, much more isolated. the French, the British have to call the Americans at some point. The other fronts, at least the Ottomans, would gradually collapse. The Italians would actually hold in spite of the 1917 German Austro-Hungarian offensive. But truly, the most important effort was the Western Front. And as such, Verdun was actually a pretty interesting chapter of experimentation, if you want, that, however, in a conceptual sense, was eliminated so that the German strategic thinking wouldn't quite want to repercur the ways that the path that had brought to it, at least in the same way it had been deemed possible. And so that something more micro, something more tactical was privileged over merely, more strategically innovative approach. The realization that limited objective attacks were sensible, and if they allowed for the conservation of troops needed in other sections of the front, was not a major revelation, of course, for an organization that had engaged in this strategy for an entire year. That's why it formed this paradox of, we almost don't see how this was relevant, what we can learn from that, because it appears to be essentially the same thing. But as von Clausewitz himself says, war is actually a pretty simple business. It's just hard. And so Verdun showed the actual way to sacrifice and butchery and savagery and unspeakable, unexplainable reality. But that's how war manifests. And if you are into that big struggle, you must accept that this is what must happen. You can't do it better or worse again, but that's essentially what you should never abandon as a general idea. The French, for their part, instead drew, as we've seen, considerable inspiration from what they had good reason to consider victory, although the casualty figures were to their disadvantage. Even though they were the defending ones, and the German offensive had stalled more due to the threat posed by the British offensive at the Somme than by the resistance of their own troops, which tells you also how close actually the Germans got to breaking France at that point. Many became convinced that if France had won an attrition battle, it had the moral superiority to win others as well. In fact, the new French tactical creed became attrition, attrition, and although it led to an increase in the casualty toll, including those executed for mutiny that apparently had served to some purpose, beyond the limits of what was already a severely compromised reasonableness, it bought the Allies the time needed to be reinforced by American troops and to steer the war towards a victorious conclusion. That's yet another chapter that we will have to illustrate, because the American arrival was gradual. As you know, there was also at some point towards the end just so much that Americans could bring, even though it was a pretty large number. But it is also showing you how much of an effort was being done in parallel for the aforementioned laws of reciprocity from the German side. Of course, how the war could be won essentially in until the last, also from Germany, it of course would have not had was risking much more, right? The Germans had realized that by this point, yes, it could break the enemy positions, but it's not like warfare would have simply, the front would have simply collapsed entirely, right? Because this is what this video is about. World affairs are very important to stress, is that you can't quite simply break through. Actually, you can't, right? Unless, in fact, the enemy is exhausted as a country rather than for any specific strategic balance, right? And so, of course, the risk of losing the war for the Entente was real till the end, except it would have less likely to escalate into some sort of total defeat, because if anything, even for Britain, yes, you could have signed an armistice or something, but it's not like Britain would have been invaded, at least immediately, in the same war by the Germans. And there were so many things that were balancing in this context that were also exhausting the respective countries. This is what happened at the end of World War I, which was incredibly risky. I mean, if it hadn't been for Poland that stopped the Red Army during the Polish-Bolshevik War in the Vistula, like, you don't know. Like, the Germans could have become a Soviet. And this is actually what, as we've seen, the Freikorps were tasked to prevent after the end of the war because of the communist revolution in Germany. This is why it's such a crucial aspect of also historical balance. Makes you see also World War II in sort of wilder terms, because once you enter in the mindset of how contained, at least in a spatial sense, warfare had been in World War I between European powers, not even actually less than what had happened during the Napoleonic Wars, albeit for different reasons than the way simply armies were made. The unpredictability of the system, let's say, what could have happened, could have not happened, of course, was much greater. So it's something that much more of a political incognitum that you have to factorialize when making any kind of assessment. So we treat often these wars as, oh, well, okay, but we know how it went. It's just a big slaughter. This is what the thing has been overly emphasized to us. Oh, and it's such a terrible thing. Yes, it is. But then why? How? How was it handled? What was actually that war about? Why? Where did all this result come from? Yeah, these are questions you can answer only when you see what was happening on the battlefield. And so what would happen later, what could have happened, which has, let's say, you don't have to make what-ifs that are fundamentally useless, but let's say just understanding what these countries were fighting for gives you vectorially the understanding of the possibilities, the potential, and fundamentally how easily things could turn in a way, of course, none of these countries would have liked, including, in fact, the ways that things went at the end of the war that were even relatively gentle. Like, people complain about the Versailles peace, etc. Actually, it's an incredibly complicated topic. It's not just like, okay, these bastards crushed the Germans. That's, Hitler is just what they got. No, right? It has minimally to do with Versailles, as a matter of fact. But it's also the situation of Europe and of the world, by the way, at Versailles that must be really understood. Not just because, of course, the future had not yet happened, but because of what had just happened, including all the history before. So it's just like Verdun. Like, nobody knew before fighting it how it would have gone. You couldn't say it. It was new. So even the fact it sort of collapsed, it's not really a real... they failed, generally speaking. It's not really, oh my god, they didn't know what they were doing. They knew. And they knew better than you do. And you also know that pretty well, right? So there are lots of issues, of course, connected with the wall. But this is why I make these long videos, which I hope you somehow can get at least something from in terms of usefulness or just critical thinking, I don't know. I, of course, plan to expand on World War I. As you understand, I've made considerable amount of videos so far about this. We will keep talking about it. Also, the same Verdun, because like this is an overview, then there are all the various battles that are very interesting and that really show you how closely fought this as any other engagement really was overall. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.